This is Blackjacked, a podcast about how the civil rights movement went left.
Oh man, I gotta get up. I gotta go. Ooh. I gotta go. I gotta go. I gotta go. I gotta get up and go. I gotta go. I gotta go. I gotta get up and go. I gotta get up and leave. I gotta get up.
Today, unfortunately, I kind of have to beat up on Dr. King a little bit. Not a lot, just like a little bit. We all know Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., of course. There are many people who believe that he reached his high point as a prophet for social change April 4th, 1967. Now, Dr. King was murdered April 4th, 1968. 1 year before that, though, he was at Riverside Church in New York, and he gave a speech speaking out against the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is one of the most controversial wars in American history. Very unpopular war to this day. It's one of the few wars where American troops came back and were not celebrated. Many were criticized, harassed, you name it. I mean, it was a very unpopular war for a lot of reasons. I can't really go into all that today. But Dr. King felt that he had to speak up about this war. He felt like, I can't tell young guys in the hood to be nonviolent when my own country is the biggest purveyor of violence on this planet. It's almost a direct quote, almost. And so he speaks out and he says that this war is evil, it's unjust. And that was a problem for a lot of people. That was certainly a problem for President Lyndon Johnson. President Johnson that helped steer the Civil Rights Act through Congress. He'd helped get the Voting Rights Act through Congress. And Johnson felt like, yo, we supposed to be good. I've helped you. I've been an ally. Like, what's the problem? And there's even a quote attributed to Johnson that after King spoke out, Johnson says, what is that GD N-word preacher doing to me? He wasn't happy. And a lot of the people in the Democratic Party were not happy. And a lot of civil rights leaders were not happy. A lot of people felt like, why don't you stick to civil rights? Why don't you stay in your lane? And I mean, even there were some Black people who felt that way. There was another person who had been very close to Dr. King, had been very helpful to Dr. King, had even been a mentor to Dr. King, Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin essentially kind of was like, yo, Dr. King, you might want to just kind of sit this out. He actually condemned anti-war protesters. And he did tell King, you need to kind of be quiet on this. He really urged him to just kind of pipe down on that. That was really interesting for a lot of people because Bayard Rustin, if you're not familiar with him, he's one of the most brilliant strategic minds behind the civil rights movement. Most people know him as the chief sort of organizer of the March on Washington in 1963. So Dr. King gives his famous I Have a Dream speech. Bayard Rustin was sort of the main organizer behind that. He had been a mentor to King. So early on with the Montgomery bus boycott, Bayard Rustin comes to Montgomery, seeks King out, and King has armed guards. He has a gun in the house, right? I'm trying to protect my family. And Rustin, he's really schooled in Gandhian nonviolence. And so he tries to kind of help King along with that and really kind of teach him. Now, Coretta Scott King was already familiar with Rustin. She had actually heard him speak way back in high school. So she was very familiar with him, admired him, and thought he was really cool. So Dr. King meets him, and he sort of becomes a mentor. And in the early days of putting together the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he was an advisor to King. And that stayed true for some time until, fast forward, Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, who was a very powerful congressman from Harlem, he threatened to out King and Rustin for being in a gay relationship. This is leading up to the 1960 Democratic Convention. SCLC, Dr. King's organization, this is still a very new organization, and they are planning this demonstration sort of targeted towards the Democratic Convention. Adam Clayton Powell, as a proud Democrat, he is not with it at all. So he wants to stop this demonstration from taking place. His tactic is, okay, I'm just going to go to the press and tell them that you two all, you guys are in a relationship. But there's zero evidence that this is true at all. He just basically makes this up. Now, Rustin was openly gay. He had run into some trouble years earlier. He had been arrested for doing some interesting things in a car. And so at this time, homosexuality is in fact criminalized, right? And so he has that stigma. He also has the stigma of having once been affiliated with the Communist Party. So he was always sort of controversial to have around, but it went to a new level when Adam Clayton Powell was just like, yo, get this dude off your team. And so there's a separation for a while. But then they sort of come back together by the time the March on Washington comes around. And so Rustin and King are back in fellowship. They're buddies again. Now, many people would have expected Rustin to be on the other side of this thing. Rustin was a pacifist. He was against all war. He wasn't even rocking with World War II. He didn't even like that. And so you're a pacifist. You've always been anti-war. And a lot of people within the civil rights movement community start to kind of get into the anti-war movement. And so when King speaks up, it sort of cements this idea that, yeah, this is the right side of history. We need to be about this. And Rustin's like, nah. And I'm arguing that Rustin was right. And King wasn't the best strategy. How can I say that? Was the Vietnam War bad? Sure, it was bad. Was it especially bad for Black people? Absolutely. There's a lot of reason why people felt like Black folks should be speaking up against the war. Because Black people were something like 11% of the U.S. population in 1967, for example. But of all the folks getting drafted, we were over 16% of the people getting drafted. It goes to a whole nother level. There's this thing called Project 100,000. Basically, Vietnam, it just kept escalating and escalating and escalating under President Johnson, where they need more and more and more troops. They have something like 23,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam in 1965. 2 years later, you have 465,000, over 465,000. This is because, in large part, Project 100. Basically, they need more and more troops. And so they're like, look, we usually have certain standards to get people in here. Let's just drop those. And so you have a sharp increase in Black troops going over there because they lower the education standards for people drafted. They lower a lot of other standards. And so they put out this big net and they catch a lot of Black people in that net. And then Black people are disproportionately assigned to combat units. So 23% of those troops over there in the combat units were Black folks. And some of the airborne units, Black people comprise 45 to maybe 60% of the troops. Now, in 1965, something like a quarter of all the casualties in the Army were Black men. There's a lot of good reasons for Black people to not like the Vietnam War. There are a lot of movement leaders who were pulling on Bayard Rustin to come out against the war. And so he wrote a response to this. He wrote this piece called Vietnam, Where I Stand. And essentially what he's saying is a lot of the folks in the movement, they were really on me about this. And they want us to know why I wasn't devoting all of my energy to the anti-war effort like they were doing. That's very important. He's saying a lot of these movement leaders were devoting all their energy to the anti-war movement, and they want me to do the same. But he says this, and this is a quote. He says, I don't believe that the civil rights movement is dead, so I am not ready to help bury it. I will not abandon it now when our problems are getting tougher and tougher. Getting decent jobs, housing, and education is harder than integrating lunch counters. We need to redouble our efforts, not dilute and divert them. Now, he's saying something that's very similar to a lot of the things that Dr. King said. If you read some of his writings, like his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? King talks about that. It's harder to create jobs than integrate a lunch counter. All true. And so he's saying, since that's true, why should we be putting our effort into everything else but our core problem? We need to be focused here. Now, a lot of people don't like Rustin's position, not just because it seems contrary to what he's been his whole life, but a lot of people feel like, you know what, he's just doing it for clout. He had always sort of been on the outside. And again, he's openly gay. He's involved in the movement in the 40s, the 50s. He's not a popular guy for this reason alone. But then you got the communist thing. And then you have the whole situation I talked about with Adam Clayton Powell. He was always forced to sort of be in the background. They couldn't really put him out publicly. And then, of course, Adam Clayton Powell says, no, you can't even have him around in the background. Like, he got to go. Rustin was always sort of marginalized. He was always sort of on the edge of things. After the March on Washington, this is successful. This is great. All of a sudden, things change for him. Rustin is now kind of like the it guy. He's on the cover of Life magazine in September of 1963. I mean, this is kind of making it. This is kind of success. 1964, the Democratic Convention is in Atlantic City that year. Bayard Rustin is riding in Hubert Humphrey's limo. Hubert Humphrey ends up being the vice president under Lyndon Johnson. This is for one of the first times of his life. Like he has access. He's the it guy. And so a lot of people felt like, yo, you just kind of in with the Democratic Party and you just want to toe the line. So that's why you're doing this. Look, some of that could be true, but it doesn't mean that he's wrong. My position would be this. Rustin is right when he says, here are the problems that we have here. He talks about how, yes, the Vietnam War is bad. Yes, it's terrible. And hopefully this thing will end. But when it ends, these Black people need to have something to come home to. And I'm concerned about that. He's concerned about poverty. He's concerned about jobs, the core things that Black people are worried about. King agrees with this, right? Remember, at the end of his life, Dr. King goes on with the Poor People's Campaign. He's looking at poverty. He's looking at jobs. He's looking at these things. And Rustin is just saying, let's not take our eye off the ball for Vietnam. Now, you could say, well, look, man, this is really impacting Black people. And so therefore, this should be a concern. I'm arguing something a little bit different. The argument is this. Black people are always the most affected group on everything. So it's always been said when America gets a cold, we get pneumonia. You can pick any issue. I don't care what it is. Generally speaking, Black people are going to be the most affected group. And so it's not a great argument to say we should focus on this because we're the most affected. What we ought to be looking at is not whether we're the most negatively impacted group. That's not the question. What we need to be asking is what will impact us most positively? Let me say that again. It's not a matter of what most negatively impacts us because we're the most negatively impacted with everything. The question needs to be what would give us the most positive impact? What would impact us the most positive? What would move us furthest along? That's how you choose your issue. All the issues impact us negatively. Name one. It doesn't matter. So it's not that Vietnam wasn't bad. It's not that it didn't impact Black people disproportionately, but everything impacts Black people disproportionately. And I know this may sound, obviously it sounds crude. It sounds callous. I mean, there are Black mothers who had to bury their son. Do you want to look this mother, this father in the face and say, yeah, no big deal? No, that's not the argument. It's just that the world is a messy, awful place and you have to make really tough decisions on public policy sometimes. It's just that if you have limited resources and limited advocacy, where do you focus it to move your people along? So Rustin is saying we have a president who's been supportive on issues that we care about. We have a president who knows how to get stuff through Congress because that's a skill. We need to be working with that president, with this party on the things that concern us and not alienating those allies. So fast forward, when Dr. King at the end of his life starts with the Poor People's Campaign, he's trying to address poverty, jobs, all the things that Rustin is talking about, but he's doing it now without the help of a really big ally, the president. Because after Dr. King spoke out, President Johnson stopped messing with him. He no longer had that access. He no longer had that listening ear and that ally. President Johnson was mad. So you're going with the Poor People's Campaign and you have no backup. You have no political covering. You have no help politically because you've alienated that ally. It was bad politics. The question is not whether or not that was the right moral position. Now we're talking about politics. And so the question is this: is Dr. King operating as a prophet of social change, or is he trying to do politics? And the problem is you can't do both sometimes. As a prophet, sure, rock out, say whatever you feel like saying. But then there's the politics. If you have a religious view on things, let me help you with this. Go back to the book of Esther. In the book of Esther, there's this guy who has this plot to kill all the Jewish people. His name is Haman. Well, this is obviously bad, right? So Esther is credited with being the hero in the story because she goes to the king and says, hey, actually, I'm Jewish and, this is an evil plot. You should stop it. And that happens. But the person who really gets Esther going is her uncle Mordecai. Mordecai won't shut up like, yo, this is bad. This is evil. And you need to do something about it. Mordecai's out there screaming at the gate. He has the right position, but the people in power don't rock with Mordecai. They either don't know him, he doesn't have the access, or they don't like him. Haman hated him. That's why this whole thing got started. Mordecai can be looked at as a prophet saying, here's the right position, but somebody had to go in and talk to the king who had access. And guess what? Esther, the king's wife, would not have had that access if she was railing all day against the king. So you can be a prophet, which is needed, which is great, but who has the access to do politics? They're not the same role. And King is trying to play the same role. And so as a prophet, he cashes out his political capital. Now he can't do politics anymore. So the Poor People's Campaign goes nowhere. All the other things that he would like to talk to President Johnson about that concern Black people, he no longer has that access. If you're a prophet, cool. But if you're trying to do politics, it's not the same thing. Rustin is looking at politics and saying, I'm focused on what Black people need, and that will sometimes require alliances. And you don't always necessarily get to speak out and blast your allies. And so Rustin makes alliances with the party. He tries to form alliances with organized labor. And through the A. Philip Randolph Institute, they try to look at how can labor come alongside of the civil rights movement and we can all win. Now, the Democratic Party and labor, they're rocking with the war. They're not against the war. So Rustin figures, if these are my allies, this is politics, it's transactional, I'm trying to get what I can get here. Maybe I just stay quiet on this. I don't agree, but this is politics. You don't always get what you want. You don't always get to say everything you want to say in politics. But he's also trying to be focused on what do my people need? And that is an important lesson for today. We often find when we're doing politics, Black people are very commonly seduced into advocacy and issues based on that same talking point. This impacts Black people more than anyone. Like I said before, everything impacts Black people more than anybody. So the people who are pro-choice, who say this is the fight that you should be invested in because this impacts poor Black women. The people who are pro-life say it's poor Black women. Like, everybody can pull out a talking point about how we're the most impacted, and they're not lying. I don't care if it's abortion. I don't care, whatever it is. Everyone will try to co-opt Black people's advocacy by saying this impacts you more than anyone. That is not the question. What would help me more than anything, what would move me forward more than anything, that's the issue I need to be focused on. We have to stop making political alliances based on somebody else's interest. Yes, this thing is bad. Yes, this impacts us. But what are the real issues that I need to be focused on? What are the things that are going to move me forward the most? Because we have limited strength, limited resources, limited advocacy. We can't go out on 20 different issues and fight them all. We have to pick one, maybe two, and let's focus on those things because those things are going to propel us the furthest. And in doing so, let's find allies on that. Those allies may not agree with us on a lot of other things, and that's okay, because right now we're talking about this. And so as much as we love and respect Dr. King, he misspent his political capital, didn't have it later to do anything else. And now what? Now, again, this sounds cruel. This sounds kind of tough. This sounds like heartless, but politics is a rough game. And so Rustin is saying, look, the war is bad. Got it. Black people don't even necessarily have the power to stop or start a war. And to be candid, a lot of those white people protesting didn't either. A lot of people will tell you what really stopped the war in Vietnam is the business community turned against it after the Tet Offensive. Again, that's another story. Don't have time to go into that. But we're screaming and hollering about something we can't stop anyway. But these people in Harlem, Mississippi, they're poor now. We need to be looking out for our interests now. Who are the allies that we have in that, and who has the skills? And that brings up another point. This is a side point. Rustin is looking at Johnson because Johnson has shown that he's very skilled in getting legislation through Congress. Just because somebody says the right thing or they have the right positions does not mean they have the skill set to get legislation passed. That is a very different thing. And so right now with Black politicians, I'm looking at this and we need to be very careful. We're applauding a lot of people because they have the right position, they have good sound bites, or they, quote unquote, read this person several weeks back, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and this the sister from Houston. I'm so sorry, I'm blanking on her name. But she's, she's badly built and all that. And everyone just applauded and, or sometimes you'll see another Black politician say something snarky to someone and everyone applauds it. That's cool. But what does that have to do with moving legislation? There is a skill set to that. You have to work it and get actual legislation and bills passed that help people. So Adam Clayton Powell, yeah, he was dirty for what he did to Rustin, but the man passed a lot of really good legislation. And so today we got a whole Black caucus doing what? And they'll say, oh, well, the Republicans, they're, we can't get anything done because they're blocking everything. Do you think Adam Clayton Powell, when he was the only Negro sitting in the room, that they loved working with him? No, but he had some skills. He understood how to move legislation, and he did. And we've got to stop applauding and awarding people because they have a nice soundbite or they snap on somebody or say something snarky. That doesn't help put food on the table. We need to identify the issue, stay focused, not based on what most impacts me negatively, but what would most benefit me. Let's stay focused on that, get the allies for that, and make sure that they're skilled allies and go with it. Now, next week, we're going to keep talking about how the civil rights movement went left. What we want to talk about next week, I think is fascinating. And it sort of goes along with what we did this week. By and large, the civil rights movement really didn't have a comprehensive economic strategy. And that was always a major flaw. And I think it sort of speaks to why we're in some of the positions we are today.
I gotta get up and go. I gotta get up and leave. I gotta get up and go. I gotta go. I gotta get up and go. They waiting on me when I walk out the door. They counting on me to get ready to blow. road. Too many people saying that I'm the hero. Too many people looking up to me. Can't let them down, not an option for me. Don't even matter if you rocking with me. I touch down even if you ain't blocking for me. No BS and no negativity. Only dealing with positive energy. Yeah, it's haters and doubters surrounding me. I don't pay them no man, they ain't stopping me. Like Brady and Jordan on top of me. I'm MVP in every category. My confidence grows every day that I rise. Gotta get up and go keep my eye on the prize. I gotta go, manifesting on my hopes and dreams. I gotta go, yo, I'm strategizing like I'm coaching the team. I got places to go, I got people to see, I got things to do. Yo, I'm through with surviving, it's time to start living, I don't know about you. That's what I see for myself, speak over my life, I got riches and wealth. Take it in stride one day at a time, no malice inside, I'm nothing but blessed.